Hello, I'm Srividya Sridharan, your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, I'm joined by Vice President and Principal Analyst Brandon Purcell to discuss AI alignment. Welcome, Brandon.
Thanks, Shri. It's great to be here.
Okay, so let's level set. Let's define what we mean by AI misalignment. There's, obviously been a lot of talk about AI going wrong. There are plenty of examples out there. You don't have to look too far. But what is AI misalignment and why does it pose significant risks to businesses?
Yeah. So I think at this point, we know that AI is only as good as the data used to train it. And today's AI, large language models and other models, are being trained on a lot of data, but that data isn't an accurate reflection of reality. We're training it on the internet, which is an incomplete, inconsistent, and often inaccurate representation of reality. It's why when Google launched its AI search, it told people to put glue on pizza to stop the cheese from slipping off. It had learned that from a humorous Reddit post, but it took it as gospel. I think we all know Reddit is not reality. So there's this distance between data and the real world. I think it's like Plato's cave in the Republic, where Plato says that we humans only experience a shadow representation of reality. That's what we're teaching AI about the world, the shadow representation from the internet. Now, when AI luminaries, Sam Altman, for example, when they're talking about alignment, they're talking about how do we ensure that a super intelligent AI system doesn't exterminate humanity. And of course, we're not here to talk about that today. But the reason we're talking about alignment is because I believe misalignment actually poses an existential threat to businesses who don't take it seriously. And just one example that a lot of folks have probably seen was this Chevy dealer in Watsonville, California, that used a GPT-powered chatbot to interface with its customers. And one customer tricked the chatbot into giving him an offer for a fully loaded Chevy Tahoe for the price of $1, and to parrot back the unassailable legal language, no takesies, backsies. Fortunately, it wasn't legally binding, but you could see how a misaligned AI that didn't have appropriate guardrails could very quickly discount you out of business.
So you mentioned, our company should be taking this seriously because you use the word existential. How seriously are companies really taking AI misalignment? I mean, is there a risk of them becoming too cautious here?
Yeah, so here's where I have to be totally honest. I'm usually the one who brings up alignment or misalignment in my conversations with clients. This isn't a term that clients use. Clients have been talking for years about AI governance, responsible AI, trustworthy AI, and all of those things are important. I think the difference between those things and AI alignment is AI governance, for example. When you bring that up, immediately risk mitigation comes to mind. And also there's a negative connotation because it's the big G word, right? It's going to cost money. It's going to take more time. It's going to constrain any sort of innovation. With AI alignment, yes, all of that is part and parcel of AI alignment. There is a risk mitigation piece, avoiding all the sticks that are out there. There's also a lot of carrots because baked into the definition is achieving your intended business objectives, getting the actual promised ROI out of this transformational technology. And so there's real top line benefit from this in addition to risk mitigation.
So that means that all our efforts and all of the companies that have been actually putting some effort into responsible AI and AI governance, now they have a mechanism to orient aligned AI to positive outcomes versus more of the risk mitigation.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Especially, I mean, you mentioned data governance, and we all know that AI is only as good as the data that's used to train it. And then in LLM systems, the data that we pointed at using retrieval augmented generation or something else, the companies who have made those investments are the ones who are ready to start reaping the rewards from AI.
Okay. So let's dig in a little bit deeper. I'm sure there's a lot of nuance in terms of the technical aspects of misalignment, but what are the types of misalignment? I mean, we only hear the headlines in the news in terms of AI going wrong, but there's a lot of nuance there. So just explain what are the different types of AI misalignment.
Yeah, so in our research, we point out that 3 different types of misalignment. One is outer misalignment, and this occurs where you have an intention or an objective for the AI system, but that intention or objective doesn't exist as a discrete variable within your data. And we often see this in predictive AI. For example, a few years back, Optum Health had a pretty noble goal for their AI system. They wanted to build a predictive model that would predict which patients would need additional health care so they could proactively care for them, keep them from being readmitted to the hospital. But they didn't have in their data a variable that said how sick somebody got. And so they used a proxy. They used how much money was spent caring for the patient. And because in the United States, because of various systemic issues, more money is spent caring for the average white patient than the average Black one, the predictive algorithm picked up on this. And as a result, about 40% of Black patients who actually deserved extra care would not have received it if Optum had continued to use this system. And fortunately, they discovered this and pulled it. But that is an example of outer misalignment where, because they used a proxy, unfortunately, their intended outcome was far from achieved. Of course, if there's outer misalignment, there's inner misalignment. Now, inner misalignment is something we haven't seen much in the wild yet, but I think we'll see more of with the advances in agentic AI that are occurring. Inner misalignment happens when an AI system learns to pursue an objective, but over time, en route to achieving that objective, it learns an additional objective, an emergent goal. You can think of an AI that's trained to navigate a maze that where the exit is on the lower right-hand corner, and it does that thousands of times. And then when you put it out in the wild and a new maze appears where the exit is in the upper right-hand corner, it just goes to the lower right-hand corner because that's the objective that it has learned over time. And I bring it up because with agentic AI, where we actually may be using reinforcement learning-based systems can actually learn these emergent goals that keep them from meeting their intended ones. Then the final one is user misalignment, and the Watsonville Chevy dealership example is an example of user misalignment, where users actually pull AI out of alignment, out of your intended objectives. And actually, the first example of this goes all the way back to Microsoft Tay, where Microsoft thought, hey, wouldn't it be great to have this chatbot that interacts with folks on Twitter? But we don't bring our best selves to Twitter, and people on Twitter baited Tay into becoming an objectionable chatbot that the Telegraph in the UK called a Hitler-loving sex robot. So there need to be guardrails around how users use these systems. Otherwise, they could pull it out of alignment for their own purposes.
I think what's interesting about these various types of misalignment is these, just by identifying them, I think companies can actually do a better job of AI ROI or AI value, which I know many are struggling with, right? Just by identifying, is it doing what it's supposed to do, and can we measure it in a tangible way?
Yeah, I mean, measurement is critical in observability to identifying misalignment, because you could put all the guardrails you want to in place. And because of this distance that we started talking about between the data that's trained in the real world, our research has found that sadly, misalignment is inevitable. It's going to happen. But if you're able to measure and observe and put in place the other best practices we'll talk about, you can stave off catastrophe and meet your business objectives.
We'll be right back after this.
Last year, Forrester predicted that legal action over privacy protections would strike a major data provider. And in 2024, 2 large firms have already settled major privacy claims. That's the power of Forrester's predictions. Want to find out what's coming in 2025? Head to forrester.com/predictions today.
So, Brandon, there's a lot of talk of agentic AI architectures, where we know that the risks of AI misalignment can be even more amplified. We're going to be giving a lot more autonomy to these AI systems. So what does AI alignment or misalignment look like in this agentic future that we're heading into?
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about agentic. In the report, we called out the 3 ages of modern AI. First, it was predictive, then generative. And when we wrote the report, we thought agentic was on the horizon. Little did we know that at Salesforce, a month after the report was published, it would be Agent Force. And now, of course, everybody's talking about agentic AI. From a misalignment perspective or an alignment perspective, agentic AI is actually a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you're exactly right. As AI scales in its power and its autonomy, it also becomes more complex, so harder to understand. The risk of misalignment goes up, and the scale of the potential impact of that misalignment goes up greatly as well. On the other hand, though, some of the agentic architectures that we're seeing, like agentic architectures that have a generator and some sort of controller or something that discerns what good or bad looks like, that's a useful alignment technique. So, yeah, agentic AI could be very scary from a misalignment perspective, but used in the right way, it can also help you to detect and prevent misalignment.
So, in your research, you are proposing this new approach of what good looks like, what aligned AI looks like. And this approach you call aligned by design. Talk to us a little bit about what does that mean? What is this approach, and how should sort of companies start putting steps in place to use that approach?
Sure. Align by design is, of course, it's based on privacy by design, where this is a proactive approach to developing AI systems to meet your intended business objectives while adhering to company values, standards, and guidelines across the AI lifecycle. It's essentially proactively embedding alignment into the systems to ensure that AI does what you want it to do and it doesn't do what you don't want it to do. Now, the big question is, okay, how do we do that? And this is where I think companies can leverage Forrester's 7 levers of trust and to build these various qualities into their AI systems to ensure that stakeholders, diverse stakeholders from customers to internal employees to partners and even regulators, trust these systems and that these systems remain aligned. Now, if you're unfamiliar with our 7 levers of trust, they are accountability, competency, consistency, dependability, empathy, integrity, and transparency. And there are different best practices from both an organizational and technical perspective that organizations can flex to build these qualities in AI.
Of these 7 levels of trust, Brandon, where should companies start? Like, which ones should they focus on first?
Well, the first one is the first one, actually, accountability. Accountability is incredibly important in this age we're in now of generative and also now agentic AI, because if you think about in the past with predictive AI, most companies were building predictive models themselves based on their own data. They were using their data science resources who were evaluating with their own measure of what good looked like. They had a lot of control. With today's AI systems, most companies are going to be inheriting a large language model, a diffusion model from a vendor, from OpenAI, from Google, maybe from Adobe. And they don't have control over how that model was created. And they're inheriting all of the inherent flaws and biases in those models. And so accountability in today's world of AI means asking vendors the right questions, demanding answers to questions around, what's the provenance of the training data that was used to train this large language model? How was the model evaluated, both for accuracy and also around different responsibility metrics like bias, for instance? Are there any indemnifications in use of this model? And for a full list of these questions, our colleague Michelle Getz actually created a wonderful resource. It's a set of questions to ask, an AI governance criteria checklist that our clients can refer to. So it's essential to ask these questions because at the end of the day, if you're using a third-party model and something goes wrong, you're the one who's going to be on the hook from a legal and regulatory perspective. And we've already seen cases of this. The National Eating Disorders Association was using a chatbot called Test from a vendor. When they started using Test, it was a deterministic chatbot. So each question had a pre-canned answer. Now, unbeknownst to the National Eating Disorders Association, the vendor who created Test upgraded it. And here I'm air quoting upgraded because it started using a GPT-based transformer to interface with users who have eating disorders. And all of a sudden, the chatbot started telling people how to count calories and lose weight, which is an awful, awful thing to do. And of course, against NEDA's very core mission. So it's so important to ask these questions, the right questions of vendors, demand answers, and know what a good answer looks like too. as part of your procurement and governance process.
Yeah, so accountability seems pretty fundamental as a starting point, especially as companies scale AI, especially with partnership with other providers. Are there others that they should focus on in terms of the building trust?
Yeah, there's empathy. We've long known that AI is biased. That was true in predictive AI. It's equally true in generative AI. Again, it all comes down to the data. And knowing that this bias exists in these systems, it's important to know, okay, for a given use case, where could harms occur? How could it harm different stakeholders, people who are impacted by this use case? And the problem is that in many companies, only a small group of people are conceiving of an AI use case, and the various stakeholders who are impacted aren't represented. Which is why I love the work that Kathy O'Neill, who wrote Weapons of Math Destruction, she's doing to corral various stakeholders to elucidate the potential harm. She did this for Olay. They had a Decode the Bias campaign, and they wanted to launch a skincare advisor which basically used computer vision to make advice for skincare routines. And they knew, of course, anything using computer vision is potentially fraught with biases. And so they brought her in to bring in various stakeholders, internal stakeholders, of course, customers and users of the system, but also experts in algorithmic justice, like the Algorithmic Justice League, to identify, okay, where could those harms occur so that we put in the appropriate guardrails.
And one of the other levers that you have in the report is also transparency. I mean, do you envision that companies are actually going to differentiate based on how explainable their AI is and how transparent their AI is?
I think so. And I think that those that do will win. So transparency is kind of a loaded term in today's world of AI because let's face it, transformers aren't transparent. 175 billion parameters, right? Like there's no way of explaining what's happening inside of that model. So first of all, you have to understand what type of transparency you're talking about, given the type of AI you're using. If you're using predictive AI, like there are actually transparent algorithms you could use, or there are well adopted interpretability techniques like Lyman chat. Transparency in the generative AI world looks a little bit different, where instead of going for complete transparency, you should strive for traceability, where you can trace, okay, how do inputs go through the system to produce an output? Maybe the large language model is in the middle of the system, but along the way, you've added value with your own applications. That should be transparent. And then in the world of agentic AI, transparency becomes even more challenging. And there, I think a lot of companies are going to probably create simulated environments and try to reproduce results to gain enough confidence that the system is working as intended before actually launching them in the real world. So I think the goal there needs to be reproducibility. But as we talked about before, no matter what type of AI you're using, from a transparency point of view, you need to strive for observability. So being able to observe, is it operating as intended, and is it harming anyone, essentially, over time.
So the Align by Design approach definitely, a lot to unpack there in terms of how to build trust, but also how to measure value for AI. And I think that's a key message in terms of, it's not just the risk aspect of this, but a proactive approach. So shifting gears a little bit, it's prediction season, and I think you were expecting this. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to predict how will we see the adoption of Align by Design as an approach as companies accelerate the use of AI within multiple use cases across their organization.
I think two things are going to happen. I think one thing I feel very confident predicting is that we will see 3 to 5 very large examples of misalignment in the headlines. Things like what I mentioned with NIDA before, and they seem to pop up every few weeks or so. But I think that we'll see some much bigger ones that involve a generative and agentic AI as companies start to adopt these systems that are much more inscrutable than their predecessors. And they could lead to legal action, regulatory fines, or just having your name smeared in the press. On the positive side, though, I also think that the companies that take an Align by Design approach, even if they don't call it that, but that institute these best practices, will actually see a quicker ROI from their AI investments. And part of it is what I said before, meeting intended objectives. But the other piece is just building trust in these systems. So many of the generative AI systems that our clients are building today are internal employee-facing systems, where employees are using them to get information or knowledge that they need to do their job. And if they don't trust the system, they're not going to use it. So companies that take transparency very seriously, that enable their employees to actually verify that the information is accurate, or they show where the information came from, those are the ones that are going to see adoption of the AI applications they're building, and therefore are going to get that ROI.
I love that we're ending on a positive note, and always fascinating to talk about what AI can do in a good way if you build it in the right way and in a robust way. So thank you, Brandon, for joining us today.
Thank you, Shri.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on LinkedIn or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.